I'm delighted to pick up right where we left off in the last panel. We are going to focus here on international collaboration in technology development. And even though the last session wasn't explicitly focused on either domestic or international R&D and innovation, clearly, even in that context, it started to get broached. And so I'm very excited here to be joined by a distinguished set of panelists who bring expertise in many different facets of international energy cooperation, from national labs to government experience to academic experience to investor experience. And I will, to dive right in, just briefly introduce each panelist as I turn to them with a lead-off question. And first we have Bob Rosner here, who is a theoretical physicist and on the faculty of the University of Chicago, Harris School, and many other institutions, a former lab director at Oregon, where he was also the chief scientist. And I wanted to begin by asking you about how international R&D cooperation fits in at the very beginning of the R&D kind of agenda, and how it starts there and begins to then make its way through the process of demonstration and eventually to commercialization. What your experience has been.
So maybe the starting point is just to say the obvious, which is that international collaboration on R&D isn't just a matter of being desirable, but it's actually necessary. And the first point there is just the perfectly obvious. We're not the only ones with good ideas. And the kinds of challenges that we heard about in the first panel, of course, are challenges that require innovation. It's perfectly obvious. And we are here in the United States not the only ones to have interesting ideas. So we want to harvest all ideas. The second is that even when we have the ambitions to do as much as possible ourselves, the fact of the matter is that we're not able in all instances to do that. One of the reasons is that in some areas that are, for example, of current interest in the United States, for example, for this administration is very interested in promoting nuclear power. It has put in substantial amount of money. Congress has done that into the budget for DOE for nuclear power. One of the issues for nuclear power is the problem of embrittlement of steels due to neutron damage. So that's an R&D question. The R has to do with understanding how steels in fact fracture, how you would make self-healing materials. And to study that, you need a facility that provides the neutron flux. Such a facility used to exist. One such facility here in the United States was at Sandia, a short pulse reactor. It no longer exists. It was closed after 2011. And some companies that are interested in doing these kinds of studies, neutron damage studies, have the challenge of where do you do this? Well, guess where such a facility exists. What country might have such a facility? It could be Russia. And it isn't Russia. So some companies have had to go there, and then you run into an additional issue, which has to do with IP, and a topic I think we'll be talking about. Some of the materials that you'd like to study are materials that are under export control. So now you have this issue of, are you going to ship export control materials to Russia to be able to do the study? So this is a huge challenge. So what other kinds of obstacles do we have? We have the problem of budgets. So maybe the easiest thing to do is just to be very specific. Consider what has happened with one of the premier fusion research projects, ITER, which is located in Cadarache, France. So how does the appropriations process work in the United States? It's annual. So every year, we get to revisit the question of how much money we'll have available to ship to France. Every year, the labs that have plasma fusion programs, the universities that have plasma fusion programs, wonder how much of a cut they're going to get the coming year in order to satisfy the requirements for an ITER. It's an annual ritual. Other countries don't do it that way. They have long-range budgets. You don't have this annual a moment of fear of what's going to happen to us, and it's a huge obstacle. It really makes folks both in the academic sector and the university and the labs a bit fearful about getting into projects of this sort. So, so my sense is that these are issues that can be addressed, that should be addressed, and resolved. We know that Congress has dealt with these issues, for example, in the context of large projects run by the Department of Defense. Typically, appropriations for large projects are multi-year in character. You don't have this annual thing, fear of what's going to happen to the budgets for these projects. But it is an issue for DOE. It's an issue for NASA as well, large projects. And it needs to be fixed.
Thanks. Our second panelist here is Mike Boots, who's the Senior Director of Advocacy and Government Relations at Gate Ventures, which is the personal office for Bill Gates. And Mike was also a senior Obama administration official, led CEQ for a period of time, and was involved in a number of critical clean energy innovation projects and undertakings, including one that was mentioned in the previous panel, which is probably the marquee initiative of the Obama administration, which was Mission Innovation and the parallel Breakthrough Energy Coalition that Bill Gates spearheaded. Mike, could you just begin by talking a little bit about how that effort initiative looked, what it was trying to do, and to the extent that it was able to address some of the issues that Bob raised, both from inside when you're on the sort of more on the mission innovation side, and now that you're on the breakthrough energy private investor side of the equation?
Sure. So I'll try to follow up on some of those comments and also pick up on some of the conversation from the first panel where both Michael and Dan and others talked about, I think, some of the trends that were motivating both the previous administration and my boss to take some action there. We really got started on it back in 2015 in the lead up to the Paris climate discussions, where I think there was a real desire on behalf of the administration to align other governments around purposeful and intentional increases in R&D spend. There was an interest from my now boss at the time to think about how you both motivate that public sector spending on this side while also trying to bring a different type of private capital to the game. And so he in particular feels very strongly, having started Microsoft, sort of with the huge benefit of the public investments that the Defense Department made in the microprocessor and the internet, that he and Paul Allen were able to build that company with a whole set of public funded R&D that otherwise they would not have spent on their own. And so when it came to energy, as folks showed on the first panel, compared to some other sectors, there has just been less public investment in that, and those trend lines have gone up and down a bit, but globally, that is a trend that is pretty indisputable. And so Bill worked hard with the folks like Secretary Moniz and energy ministers around the world and some world leaders to try to motivate this thing that became Mission Innovation, where the goal was pretty basic, frankly. It was to encourage increased collaboration around early stage R&D, and more specifically, as Melanie mentioned, to double the public spend on R&D in a 5-year period. So to take it from 2016 at a level globally that was about $15 billion a year to a level of $30 billion a year by 2021. It involved in doing that about 22 countries plus the European Commission, a group that covers about 60% of the globe's population and about 80% of the public spend that happens on clean energy R&D. And it was a completely cooperative setup. So there was sort of no legal hinges to sort of how they played with each other, but the idea was to work together and to do really two things. And just as by way of quick update, what's happened in the last 3 years, there has been both forward movement on the money piece that they were focused on and the enhanced collaboration across specific technology areas. So, collectively, although we can talk about this later, there have been some problems in trying to track how much money has been spent on this and sort of where each government is compared to the baselines it set back in 2016. There is about $3 billion a year more being spent by those countries each year than there was 3 years ago. And so that in and of itself is a positive sign. At the same time, there is increased alignment around specific technology areas that they have collectively identified as the most important potential breakthrough technologies. And so there are innovation challenges in their vocabulary around things like smart grids and carbon capture, around advanced materials, around pulling fuels from sunlight, those sorts of things. And there are governments leading or together leading each of those innovation challenge areas. So we can talk more about kind of what's come out of that, but that's generally where mission innovation is. At the same time, as Pete mentioned, my current boss, started this thing called the Breakthrough Energy Coalition, which was essentially to say, great, while you're increasing that pipeline of innovation coming out of the public sector, the private sector needs to do a better job of grabbing that stuff out of labs and universities and commercializing it, building companies around it, and taking it to market. And as somebody who lost a bunch of money in the first few rounds of clean tech investing, he thought he needed to align a set of investors who had two things: more patience, as we talked about earlier, given the difference in energy from some other sectors, and more flexibility in where they put their money. And so Breakthrough Energy Coalition started as a set of 20+ high net worth individuals around the world. People like Bill and Richard Branson and Jeff Bezos and Mike Bloomberg and Jack Ma and Masa-san and at SoftBank, those sorts of folks who had flexibility and patience. And in the last year, what we did is we added a set of about 20 companies and institutions to join those individuals in this Breakthrough Energy Coalition. And those are everyone from some energy companies like Total and Engie in France or Reliance in India, some banks like Wells Fargo and BNP, some large branded companies like Microsoft and Virgin and GE, and then a set of other investors like the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative in Europe. And together, the first thing that those folks did was set up a Breakthrough Energy Venture Fund, which is a $1 billion+ fund that is a 20-year fund. So compared to most venture funds in this space, has a much longer glide path. And again, super flexible in that it can invest in anywhere along the innovation cycle, from very early stage all the way through to kind of pre-commercial. And so that fund has now spent about $100 million of its $1 billion with a set of portfolio companies that were just announced a few weeks ago. Everything from companies that are trying to reduce CO2 emissions from concrete to kind of the next class of battery chemistry to the next generation of geothermal. And so together, those two prongs, both the public sector investment through mission innovation and this kind of trying to course correct on the private sector investment side, are the two pieces that we spend a lot of time on.
Thank you. And this brings us to Joanna Lewis, who's this Associate Professor of Science, Technology, and International Affairs at Georgetown School of Foreign Service, and also the faculty affiliate with the China Energy Group at LB&L. One of the issues that was raised also in the previous panel was China. And obviously, for various reasons, it's attractive to think about what it would mean to accelerate, deepen US-China collaboration in this space. We heard Michael say that to the extent that we are subsidizing R&D, spillover that occurs in China is to the good because their ability to decarbonize directly benefits us and the whole world as well. So before we kind of go into that, we also need to recognize that, of course, China is not just like every other country in many other ways too. That they have a different economic arrangement. We have a different kind of competitive, strategic competitive relationship with them that also has to be managed. And so simply the politics of whether or not we should be the ones subsidizing China's clean energy investment, or whether maybe China should be subsidizing U.S. clean energy investment, can become complicated too. So could you just begin by offering your thoughts on what the state of that relationship is right now, and then we can kind of talk about the opportunities there.
Sure. Well, I think, the state of the U.S.-China relationship, I think most people in this room are familiar with. It's certainly a tense time, and this obviously makes a relatively challenging environment for cooperation, specifically cooperation on the climate and clean energy space, which I think, until recently had really been one of the high points of the U.S.-China relationship. It was really, I think this is actually one of the areas where we do have a lot of mutual interests, and I'll talk a little bit about the work happening there later. But of course, the overall tensions, particularly related to trade, industrial policy, technology transfer, which are real concerns and are actually, I would argue, not partisan concerns. I think these are concerns that have been around for a long time. I think where the disagreements lie, in Washington and beyond, is sort of whether we pursue engagement with China to work through some of these issues. So, for example, the work that the USPTO has been doing with its Chinese counterparts to try to improve the patent system, reform the patent system, improve IP protections, et cetera, or whether we sort of restrict our interactions with China and wait till they clean up their act in this area. I, not surprisingly, would sort of vote for engagement in this area, and I'll briefly talk a bit about why that is. I mean, I think first of all, as I'm sure you've heard from sort of a broad brush look at the data, China is going to increasingly lead not only in R&D investments in the clean energy space, but also in the outputs in innovation. And this is something that is not just that you can sort of measure anecdotally. You can actually look at what we're seeing in terms of the value added in clean tech manufacturing, sort of how China is increasingly able to capture more of that. How you can look at clean tech company revenues, you can look at late stage private investment, M&As, IPOs, the number of publicly traded companies in this sector, the patent activity. These are all metrics that are really increasing rapidly in China, and I think that's something that we maybe haven't recognized for a while, where it's sort of one thing to just pour a bunch of money into R&D, and I should say China is second in clean energy R&D after the U.S. and increasing rapidly. And China may actually be one of the few countries, I think, to meet its mission innovation pledge to double its R&D in the coming years. So I think that's certainly an important signal. And I think, you mentioned sort of how China's governance structures are different, and this, of course, can work to their advantage when we talk about innovation. I think it's fair to say, we don't have a really coherent innovation policy here in this country necessarily. We have multiple actors, multiple institutions. There's obviously benefits to that, but the top-down nature of China's policymaking really allowed the government to take this foresight of their leadership to encourage entry into strategic emerging industries, including in the clean tech sector, that really positioned China to become the global leader in these technologies that we see today. So, I think that, I don't want to sort of brush over the challenges related to China's industrial policy and IP, and maybe we can come back to this, but I think it's also important to point out that there are some, a lot of my work looks at sort of the political economy of supporting clean energy industries and how many countries around the world, not just emerging economies that are trying to catch up with the first movers in the clean tech sector, but also industrialized countries use things like local content requirements to sort of force local markets, local manufacturing in the clean energy space, because this is an area that you want to capture local economic benefits, you want local job opportunities from this, and because of global supply chains, that wouldn't necessarily always make sense. And so we look for ways to do that. That's something, again, that not just China does, Canada has done this, right? We've done this at various points. So I think this is actually a problem we need to work through globally, possibly through WTO or through other channels. So I think a combination of current U.S.-China tensions as well as the current politics and shift away from climate policy in the United States certainly makes this, we have a much scaled back program of bilateral cooperation with China right now in the clean energy space in general, and including for R&D cooperation. But despite these tensions, science and technology cooperation does continue in this area. One program you may be familiar with, the US-China Clean Energy Research Center, is continuing. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that, which we can maybe discuss later. But I would say this is one of our flagship programs with China. And it's one area where we're moving forward.
Thanks. So I just want to pick up on one of the themes that seems to have run through all of this, and also through the previous panel, which is one of the things that's not maybe only unique to energy R&D, but certainly one of its defining features is that at the end of the R&D process, we are looking for commercialization. That we need a product. This is not building military hardware. To Bob's point, you're not building something for NASA, which has one consumer, one buyer with limitless money. But instead, the idea is that you have to eventually bring this to the marketplace. So, and this picks up some of the issues, I think, with dealing with China, but it's probably true with other countries as well, which is to what extent is R&D cooperation a scientific enterprise, and to what extent is it a commercial enterprise? And to the extent that it's the latter, how do you deal with who captures that benefit? Because while the atmosphere may benefit from the deployment of clean energy globally, companies will also benefit. And obviously there's a competition about which countries those companies are based in. So how do you think about that relationship between the two? Bob?
No, so maybe it's useful to think about a specific example that illustrates what some of the issues are. So when I was at Argonne as lab director, one of the things that the lab had done is do a fair amount of research on lithium-ion batteries, in particular looking at formulations that didn't have the exothermic reaction that lithium-ion batteries are so notorious for. The reason that they start to burn, some of them. So we had actually developed a formulation that seemed to get around that problem. And it turned out that project was funded under the Freedom Car Initiative. The Freedom Car Initiative had an interesting constraint on licensing. I mean, labs, like what you heard from the previous panel, labs like universities would like to make money on the inventions. So the Freedom Car Initiative had the constraint that the licenses could not be exclusive. So we went out and shopped this product, and companies like 3M, major companies that are in the business of making commodity items, basically said, no, not interested as long as it's not an exclusive license. So we were unsuccessful until it turns out a Japanese company decided, gee, I think we'll take the non-exclusive license. And the president of the company came over, we signed an agreement. They ended up building a plant in Windsor, Canada, that then supplied a battery manufacturer on the other side in the Detroit area. Very successful. And I asked that president, so what is it that made you sign the non-exclusive license agreement? And his answer was, we think we just run faster. And that is a fundamental issue, I think, that we see over and over again. In the first panel, we heard a lot about that the major companies need to get invested. They need to participate. But the government has a role to think about what its licensing procedures are. And sometimes, clearly the exclusive license provision was designed to try to keep things in country, but in fact it worked exactly the opposite. So you have all these non-intended consequences, and I'd be very interested to know how to fix that. I'm a physicist, I'm not a policy guy, and I always thought that politics is the art of the possible. Well, how do you do this?
Question for you, Mike.
Yeah. I was going to say, as it relates to mission innovation, first of all, your framing, Pete, I think is right, that this is a highly competitive space. And so mission innovation is a, honestly, very competitive exercise wrapped in the envelope of cooperation, right? That you're going to have 20 plus countries doing early stage coordination. Again, for all the reasons I mentioned earlier, we think that's a very positive development. But the day-to-day interaction between those 20 plus actors is hugely competitive in terms of grabbing the market that comes out on the other end. And I would argue that part of what the challenge is just a structural one, in that as great as I think it has been, mission innovation is largely a set of sometimes energy ministers, sometimes research ministers from around the world who get together to try to collaborate on those possibilities. It's aligned, but not sort of integrated with the same folks, or with other folks across those governments who get together each year as part of the Clean Energy Ministerial, which is much more focused on deployment and getting things to market. And in some cases, most cases in those governments, those dollars are very segregated in terms of what is sort of early stage R&D and what is tilted towards the market. I think one of the challenges that mission innovation has experienced is aligning that thirst for and kind of drive for really investing in the early stage R&D and aligning it with any kind of market demand on the backside. And so you end up having, through conversations with a number of these governments, you realize, yes, they are increasing these budgets. Yes, that's generally a good thing for the purposes that we've been talking about today. But they are even very self-aware that those dollars may be misaligned with where the market needs them to be, so that they're off doing research in their labs and universities that may end up staying in those labs and universities. Right. And so I think structurally there's some fixing to be done in national governments around the world to address that. I'm not entirely sure that programs like mission innovation, again, sort of competition housed within a collaborative setup, is the best place to sort that out. But it's, again, for all the reasons I described earlier, we think it's a good development, but there's more that comes out of watching that implemented.
Do you think it's actually, mission innovation has encouraged international cooperation between members, or is this much more, as you said, a kind of a nationally driven target? We're going to double our R&D, but do you think but we don't necessarily need to cooperate more with other countries in the process?
So I actually think there has been a good bit of collaboration, not at the macro level of sort of doubling R&D, right? That has been a helpful construct to get it started. We can talk more about later about sort of where that might evolve to, because I think just the pure focus on dollars may not be the most important thing. On the back end of that, in terms of what that investment delivers, these innovation challenges that they have set up, which there are 7 of them now, really force those member countries to pick a few that they want to lead on. And so in each of those, there's 2 or 3 or 5 governments that are putting time and resources and people towards aligning kind of a technology roadmap and a set of work that emerges in those lanes. So around carbon capture, right, there's 5 or 6 countries that are really investing in kind of, I would say, showing their cards more than they did 5 years ago, about where they're putting their money, where they think the market is on that, and why, kind of what they could be doing in each other's universities and labs across national borders will advance that. So that's real. Whether that yields something in the market, like we've been talking about, is a slightly different question. But we, again, feel like it is a set of, in some ways, baby steps of first having to intentionally collaborate across those borders, which is why this thing got started. Then to really do some of that work in technology-specific lanes, which is great. Now it needs to evolve into something that's very focused on outcomes out of that research and what the market is that will come from it.
Yeah, so I think that one thing that is particularly interesting about this kind of work is to watch different countries go about this pipeline issue from basic research all the way to development and finally deployment in very different ways. Yeah. So I had really an enlightening experience in Germany. I was a senator of the Helmholtz-Gemeinschaft, Helmholtz Association, for about a decade. And the Germans have much of their R&D goes on in laboratories as opposed to universities. On the R side are the Max Plancks, the big Helmholtz labs, which are basically the facility labs, much like the American national labs. And then you have the Fraunhofers. And there is a handover there's a pipeline that goes from the basic research all the way to the Fraunhofers. And the Fraunhofers have this interesting feature that by mandate, half of their funding has to come from industry. And in fact, there's very close coupling between industry. Industry actually sends their people into the Fraunhofer labs to work directly with the people that are doing mostly the D. So it's something that I think here, we heard this in the previous panel, industrial policy is a poisonous phrase here in the United States. The Germans love it, clearly. And maybe there's something to be learned here. Certainly at the American national labs, this issue of to what extent do we allow companies into the fold is an issue. And I think we haven't really come to grips with exactly how to do that best.
Great point and a great setup for you, Joanna, because China obviously has probably maybe it's warmer, it's more on the German side of that spectrum than on the American side of that spectrum. Right. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on what that means and also how it informs this other question we were talking about how China's approach to R&D collaboration as both a kind of research enterprise of creating public goods and as part of its industrial policy.
Well, maybe let me come back to this example that I had started to talk about of the US-China Clean Energy Research Center, because I think this actually is sort of a microcosm for sort of understanding, again, sort of the rationale for government collaboration more on the basic research side, and then with a pre-commercial lens, and then in terms of why companies would want to be engaged in an endeavor like this. I mean, I think if you look at the CERC, as it's called, what is somewhat unique about this, first of all, both sides are bringing money to the table here. So this is not an aid partnership. This is truly the Chinese government is kicking in 50%, US government 50%, and then you've got private sector matching as well. And so this is a very sort of different model. It's a true public-private partnership, as we say. And the technology areas are very, they're very much mutually decided, right? It's areas where we both are in the pre-competitive space primarily, but technologies that both countries sort of see playing an important role in their energy futures, right? So that's one. There's, I think, a lot of reasons why U.S. companies, for example, see benefits to being part of something like this, because again, most of what they're doing is, they're of course looking to the Chinese market. They want a foot in the door in some cases, but again, what I think is helpful here, having companies in the room, even when you have the national labs and the universities sort of more involved in some of the pre-commercial work, is you can, the way this is set up is the companies are providing oversight and advising to even the basic research being done to sort of say, we see this as being potentially valuable down the road. We see, potential commercial applications here, because this is not meant to be a purely fundamental research program. It's meant to be, very much a pre-commercial, sort of looking for ways we can increase value added in R&D in areas that might not get developed otherwise, and where China has specific, specific information knowledge, benefits to contributing in these areas. So I think, this is one of the reasons why also that I think it's helpful to have this kind of a setup is, you do have real challenges, sometimes US companies doing business in China, having them sort of under the umbrella of these sort of more officially stamped bilateral partnerships. And this was a partnership that was originally signed off by the Chinese president, by very high level ministers. You can actually see the government intervening on IP issues, where you've had companies sort of come in and say, they're negotiating joint ventures completely in the commercial space in China, but then they say, we're doing this kind of under this broader framework of cooperation in science and technology, and by the way, you need to stick to sort of the initial things we agreed on, and this really allows that actually to happen. So, I think that's sort of an aside, but it is an important piece. And, on the IP issue, which I want to come back to, something again that I think was unique about this partnership, and hasn't been perfect, but again, was really, I think, important, is that they took the IP issue head on. They negotiated an IP agreement up front, and this is rarely done in these types of partnerships. You had a bilaterally negotiated dual language intellectual property agreement of how, you would handle background IP, IP that was jointly developed. and all kinds of training programs and everything that sort of went along with this to make sure that, everyone from the researchers to the lawyers involved, was on the same page. And so again, this is a tricky territory, right? But I think it's great that this is taken up, right? Because again, you can kind of skirt around the issues, or you can try to pioneer these new models of how you can actually do international technology cooperation and have IP protections that allow people to come together in a way that they're gonna feel more confident, whether you're coming from the national labs or from the private sector.
You also mentioned when you added a second D to RD&D, and I know that one of the on the pathway to commercialization out of R&D we get to demonstration. Is there something in your experience here that makes that we should be thinking about that demonstration piece differently from the R&D space in terms of international cooperation specifically? Are there different opportunities or challenges there from the ones that we've already been discussing?
I mean, the way I like to think about this, because at this point, you're multinational companies, you have these globalized supply chains, you're looking for ways to sort of conduct every stage of the R, D, D, and D chain in sort of the best place for that, right? So, and Chinese companies are really no different actually in being very smart about this, right? So, I look at Chinese wind energy companies, for example, who say, we really need expertise in a certain blade material technology. So they go to Denmark and they set up an R&D center in partnership, with some engineers there. Or they find specific expertise they need in Germany. They set up a partnership there. Maybe they go to India, right? So there's sort of no reason not to be doing that. And I think, to your point, I'm more on the demonstration side. Of course, we know China has the capital and the policy environment that allows for building demonstrations quickly. There's obviously some challenges with that, but there's plenty of U.S. companies that have technologies in the lab. They would really like to build first commercial demonstrations so they can show their investors, that this is this technology will actually work. But it's very hard often to get the finance to do that here. I mean, it's good to hear that there's sort of new models of investment to do that. But China has the government has a lot of money, public money that is sort of more towards the demonstration deployment piece of the RD, and D angle. And that's something that, again, foreign companies have been able to benefit from through partnerships and elsewhere.
I would also just say, to your point about having both the capital and the policy structures in place, right? The truth is those two things together don't exist in a lot of places to incentivize that. So even in places where, like the European Commission across Europe, right, where there's a relatively large amount of capital compared to most countries, certainly that are part of mission innovation. After the US and China, the EC brings the most money to that game. They have a ton of vehicles through their public capital that are intended to incentivize exactly what you described. And yet very few folks with private capital are wanting to play in that space with them, largely because of kind of the bureaucratic reputation and process that is any large government like the European Commission, but also because that public capital comes with some constraints that don't line up well with where those people want to put the private money for demonstration and other things, and that ends up then leaving so much of that money on the table. And so increasingly we're seeing, I should have said, in addition to adding a bunch of companies to the Breakthrough Energy Coalition, we picked 5 of the mission innovation countries to also try to just go deep with those who had either significant capital or had sort of the political and policy setups that looked most likely to incentivize that kind of creativity. And so we're doing that with Canada and Mexico, with the UK and France and the European Commission. And increasingly, those governments, I think, are recognizing that, yes, they have pools of money, but they need to change some of the constraints around that public capital and the policy structures that go around them in order to leverage the private capital that they put it there for in the first place.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that there's one additional issue for doing demonstrations here in the United States is the regulatory environment here, which tends to be much more restrictive, and is the reason why some American companies looking to China, to move to China to do those demos. precisely because their regulatory environment is much less restrictive. Some people would say non-existent, but certainly much less restrictive.
And that raises another interesting question. We've been talking primarily about, we've been talking almost entirely about advanced economies. We had Melanie presented her slide on where population growth is going forward. We have 1 billion people who still don't have access to modern, reliable energy services. Is our innovation, international cooperation, architecture being built for the solutions for those people as well? And to what extent, or is it because where the capital is, there's its IP developed in advanced labs and being deployed in places with lots of ready capital and a very forgiving regulatory environment in China? Are those solutions not likely to emerge out of this model? I'm sure that's a concern for yours, Mike, but I'd be curious as to what everyone thinks we can do to make sure that we're also addressing those needs. Some of it might be spillover. Maybe you say, off-grid technology will probably be a helpful solution in some of those situations. But in general, how do we think about that?
I can start. So, a lot of countries look at the China model and say, we want to do this, right? Like, we want solar energy, so we want wind energy, we want to sort of replicate China's industrial path and become, not only the largest deployer of these technologies, but the manufacturing powerhouse, right? Because it's a way to capture, as I mentioned, economic benefits. But of course, not every country sort of has that manufacturing capacity, has the broader innovation ecosystem to sort of support these industries, right? Not to mention, we don't necessarily need every country to be, manufacturing these technologies from scratch, right? When there are sort of reasons to look at these global supply chains. So, I think there's real challenges. India is a great example. This isn't, where India has been trying to build up its solar industries, trying to compete with China, is basically using all kinds of industrial policies to try to get there. And, it's not working great, right? And then you look at, smaller developing countries that are, again, not in sort of maybe a position to build up these industries, so they're sort of relying on exported technology from China. And again, it takes this kind of broader environment for these technologies to thrive. You can't just dump a bunch of solar panels, right? And the policy ecosystem and the kind of broader technology support environment to build. So I think a lot of the focus is actually on the policy and regulatory environment. If you look, for example, at the NDCs, we call them the pledges that countries have made for the Paris Agreement. A lot of countries that sort of are very early developing countries, the poorer, less developed countries that weren't sort of ready to take absolute carbon targets, took renewable energy targets, like very aggressive renewable energy targets. But if you look at sort of the likelihood of their ability to meet these targets, sort of with their access to these technologies, it's, I think, very low right now. And so I think this is going to be a huge issue, particularly if you look at the recent IPCC report, right, and sort of the real infrastructure shift we're going to need to see in the next 10 years or so. So I think this should be a bigger focus.
Yeah, maybe again, it's useful to think of an example. So in the United States, in the nuclear space, much of the R&D in the labs is going in the direction of small modular reactors. Mm-hmm. And I think from the previous panel, we heard that the likelihood that we're going to see a nuclear renaissance in the United States within this century is not high. So you have to ask yourself, so why are we doing this? Who's the customer? And I think the answer here is these reactors are in fact really well suited for places that don't have well-developed grids, where they do not have integrated national grids, where you really want to have microgrids or perhaps macro, but not national grids. They're the right size, and they have capital requirements. Initially, the capex is relatively modest compared to the gigawatt scale reactors. So a country, for example, let's take African countries like Nigeria. Probably a gigawatt scale reactor makes no sense for a country like Nigeria because they do not have the grid infrastructure to be able to absorb the power from such a reactor. But they would be able to do that from the point of view of SMRs. So I think there are from the point of view of the the manufacturing capability in the United States, that's an important issue because one of the issues for SMRs is for a company to decide they're going to go into the business of manufacturing these things. Think of what a company like Boeing or Airbus does when they start a new airline, let's say a 787. They would never imagine opening up a production line if they didn't have an order book. The order book is essential. So to think about a company like NuScale to build an actual manufacturing facility for these reactors, they need an order book. The order book is not going to be an American order book. What utility here is going to want to have these reactors? But one could imagine building an order book based on foreign sales. And so one can see a path for them. And one of the key questions is going to be, how is that going to be done? That's an interesting policy question. Is the federal government going to help them in establishing the order book abroad? Because that would be essential for them.
I would just echo what both of you said. I think I'm not sure the mission innovation countries, while some of those innovation challenges will be applicable, as you said, right, off-grid stuff, and is useful in those other developing markets. I don't think, because those folks aren't at the table, it's not as integrated as a conversation as it should be about the needs and the demands on that side of it to inform where those MI countries are putting their money. So that's one thing. On the breakthrough energy side, I would say that is precisely the place where most of these investors see the most opportunity for growth, right? I mean, it's just for all the charts that were put up in the first panel, that's where energy demand is growing. And so these investors are looking for solutions that will scale, maybe soon, maybe it'll take a decade or two, but in places where there's a more durable demand path that looks like there's a customer base there ready. As Bob said, I think the challenge there is in most of those places, there's both a policy structure that is nascent at best in many cases, and market structures that are not terribly structured. And so trying to come in with somebody else sort of doing some of the legwork for kind of minimizing the cost of doing business in those markets, so that they don't have to take on that burden and that cost. That is what I think many of these investors are part of. One of the things that the Breakthrough Energy Coalition, the set of members, is super interested in is areas of co-investment. So we've got a set of, obviously, some venture folks at the table. We have some institutional investors. We have some companies that are spending everything from R&D through to commercialization, and we have some banks that are mostly focused on project finance. That set of actors are super interested in thinking about how you weave that blend of finance together in different geographies, where maybe before the conversation had just been sort of how do we get venture in over here, or how do we get project finance in hard-to-reach geographies. We're trying to nest that together. It is challenging in places where both the market structure is less clear and where the policy systems are not yet developed in a way that gives these investors some certainty that the rules won't change a few years down the road.
So I wanted to do a variation on Amy's question, which was to rank 1 to 10 what the job you think the Trump administration was doing in this area, and instead modify it to ask you if there was one thing that the Trump administration could do that would cause you to bump them up a couple of points in your estimation from whatever your baseline is. What would it be? What would be the thing that they could realistically affect? Because I know a lot of what we're talking about here, and it's interesting, is not just the labs, but the whole ecosystem around them, the wraparound of the national academies, or be it the policy and regulatory environment. But what is the thing that is in our power to do at this point if we are so inclined?
So I'd love to start.
Yes.
So I think the answer was actually given in the first panel. The first panel, they pointed out that the budgets in the R&D space that are passed by Congress are actually pretty good. They're healthy. And if the administration actually aligned its budget proposals with what Congress is willing to do, that would be a really good idea. Okay?
I guess I would say I would encourage them to engage in this international space. So I think it's always hard in any administration to sort of embrace the previous administration's initiatives as your own, right? That's just not in anyone's DNA who's in these political positions. So asking them to embrace fully mission innovation is a stretch because it came from the previous administration. That said, as people have been mentioning all day, because of where the budgets are, we're actually on the path to fulfilling some of our commitment, and that's a good thing, and we should own that. And they can own that. And I think by engaging in a way there, they can drive some reform that is more helpful and more likely to lead this international collaboration effort towards some good outcomes, which are two things, I would say. By engaging, they could go and say, this is not just about the money. Great that we're all on a path towards getting there. Let's make this about the outcomes and the deliverables that come out of this. Let's set hard targets in each of these technology areas that by kind of joining forces, we can do kind of like what Sunshot did here domestically, setting an aggressive target and really driving on not just the technology development side, but on system integration and the marketplace, really trying to tie that together. I think they could affect some change on that. And then secondly, I think by engaging, they could up the level of transparency and accountability in a good way. So, for all the reasons I described earlier, different countries set different baselines at the start of this program. I think, and so they don't report on a very kind of consistent way. It's hard to judge how close we are or not to the goal. I think the Trump administration could come in and sort of demand some higher levels of accountability, which would frankly show that the U.S. is delivering, as Bob said, in a way that's not sort of out there right now in the popular press, and make it more likely that as new political leadership comes in all these countries around the globe, that kind of effort gets sustained. Most of the people that signed up for mission innovation no longer have their jobs, right? They're no longer the prime ministers and presidents of those countries. And so I think you only kind of sustain that over time if you have some level of accountability that makes people see the political benefit for them.
Last word.
I disagree. No, I was going to say the same thing. I also was going to make a call for continuing to engage, and of course with China in particular, right? Because this is, I think, a really challenging time in the relationship. And I just personally don't think that we're going to solve the things we would like to see change within China without having hard conversations, without doing capacity building. And I think we often forget that as China is becoming more of an innovative country in its own right, as it is becoming, home to these, very innovative startup companies, small companies that have a very hard time competing with the big state-owned enterprises and are very, they're not well protected on intellectual property and other areas. You're seeing really like a bottom-up movement for stronger IP protections and better business environment within China by actors from China. And so, it's, I think, a missed opportunity to not be engaging with this broader set of actors and, really in many ways helping China achieve goals that it would like to see, achieved domestically. That's not to say there's not room for some of the sticks as well, as the carrots. But again, I just think there's a lot of tough conversations that have to be had, and at the moment the conversation lines are not open, and we don't get a lot of information about what's really happening there because of data issues, because of transparency issues, unless we have this type of open engagement, which is really helpful, I think, not just for researchers, but for companies in the long run.
I just want to add one last thing, which is sort of a cry from the heart that we heard from Dan Ocera in the first panel, which was that if you want private industry to really get engaged, and you need to have them engaged, they are looking for policy certainty. They are looking for consistency over long term, and we're talking about on a decade scale. And the kind of issue that we just heard, which is that if things change every 4 years or every 8 years, that's not a prescription for inviting industry in. That's a prescription for causing, in fact, industry to pull back.
Well, I want to make sure that we give time for the audience here too to ask, take advantage of the expertise we have here on the panel. And so if at this time, we could, Vicky's there with one mic. If folks in the audience have questions, please indicate so and identify yourself. Oh.
Adam Siegel again. I'm sorry for specifically on breakthrough. For sort of two questions for investment decision making. Is it 100% sort of traditional financial modeling, or are, for example, is there social? Secondly, I'd say that your presence here might be an indication of yes. About engagement in policy, is Gates Venture, Breakthrough Energy Coalition seeking to enable subsidies for fossil fuels, and how that.
So on the first, the investment criteria are, there's a few different investment criteria. It's on the Breakthrough Energy website, but there's things like, will Breakthrough's type of capital that they can bring to the equation attract other private capital over time? Is their kind of capital what could uniquely help bring something from where it is to where it needs to be for level of patience or whatever? And then there's a climate impact piece of it, which is that the fund is challenging itself to only invest in technologies that have the potential to reduce GHG emissions by 0.5 gigaton a year. So that eliminates some stuff from what they will consider. But again, to my earlier point, the kind of return on investment criteria piece on that is a much longer return on investment landscape, right? They are a 20-year fund. These people who have put money into it expect to make money out of all of these bets that they're making, or many of the bets that they're making, but they're fine if that takes a fair bit of time to get there. On your second question, so Gates Ventures is Bill's private office that is a different enterprise than he's done in the past. We've been around for about 10 years, but only in DC for the last few. And it's meant to try to think about kind of, are there places where our engagement on policy can be helpful in moving forward issues that are important to the things that Bill is spending his time and money on. And so certainly when it comes to this topic of energy innovation, we spend a fair bit of time thinking about on both the money side and the policy side, sort of what that landscape looks like. I will say on Breakthrough Energy, those companies are not coming, or we're not funding them because they have some policy interest in that, and we did not align the coalition, which about half of them are U.S. companies or investors, half of them are not, because they wanted to align around policy advocacy. That said, they're all super mindful for what we've all been talking about, that you could make investments in a bunch of these bets and have many of them fail because there's no policy structure into which they're likely to be successful. And so one of the things we're doing now as the fund really does its analysis on where to put that capital is to do a similar analysis on sort of what the biggest hurdles are towards those likely areas of investment. There are 5 challenge areas that the fund looks in, as started to make investments in all 5 of those, and really thinking through what those hurdles are so that these portfolio companies are most likely to be successful. Yes, we are spending time on trying to tackle that.
Other questions?
Hello, Teresa Williams. I am a AAAS fellow on the House Committee on Energy and Commerce. And my question is mostly for Joanna, but just wondering how the shift in leadership in both Secretary of State recently and also our National Security Advisor, and more of a nationalistic type of approach, how does that have an impact potentially on looking at international collaboration with China, for example?
Well, as I mentioned, I mean, I think the both the kind of number of channels of cooperation and the sort of depth has been scaled back, I think, dramatically. And again, in the clean energy space, it's actually one area where things are continuing, but the relationship is a holistic one. And even in the last administration, where there was a lot happening in the climate space, anytime there'd be tensions in other areas, whether it's South China Sea or cybersecurity, it spills over, right? So you can't sort of do cooperation on any one issue in isolation. And this is just two countries, two of the biggest countries in the world. But when you start to look at these broader mission innovation type, we've got 20 plus countries and actors. There's obviously a lot of sort of broader political challenges. I think the technical cooperation is actually where you can often keep a lot of activities happening. In the national labs, for example, cooperation continues, right? And so these are U.S. government entities, but it's much more in the research space than in the sort of political realm. And so I think that's an area where it's very important to keep cooperation going. And of course, visa challenges aside, we have a huge amounts of cooperation happening in academia with students being trained here, our students going there, et cetera, which is I think in the long run very valuable.
Other questions? Yes.
Hi, Bill Hederman, University of Pennsylvania again. I have a remark about the national labs. I think when they cooperate, it's a little bit more like OPEC than a bunch of departments at a university. I'm not sure that that's always getting to the right outcomes, but it's dividing up a market. My question was about the flexibility and accountability that Mike mentioned. How is that working on the private sector side of the mission innovation? Is that moving? I don't see how it moves beyond express sentiment until many years from now. I was just wondering what's going on there.
Say more about that, transparency and accountability.
Well, so you talked about the goals of patient money and flexible investment, and the governments are moving forward on advancing their R&D budgets, but I don't think we've seen noticeable outcomes yet. So what the private sector side has committed to is when the technologies are ready, we're ready to jump in and fund. And just wondering what is moving forward on that side in terms of either mechanisms or model contracts being developed or anything like that. How is that side of the 20 billion plus 20 billion equation moving forward?
Yeah, I actually think it's a tricky exercise only because of the varying timescales on this, right? I mean, much of the stuff that's ready for any kind of investment from investors like those in breakthrough energy are things that did not get started 3 years ago when mission innovation got started, right? They're things that have been in the labs and the universities predating that. So there's a set of work that is being pulled out of those kinds of institutions, both by folks like Breakthrough, like OGCI, and like other venture and equity investors around the world. I think what you're asking, which is a good question, is how are those folks who can bring private capital to the game kind of anticipating where those investments that are being made now in things like mission innovation, how are they going to access that down the road? And part of that, could come from sort of advanced commitments around procurement and making sure that there's buyers out there so that these investors feel more confident that their money now will yield something down the road. I frankly think that's not a place where either the Clean Energy Ministerial or Mission Innovation have been spending enough time. They've struggled, I think they would admit it, to get private investors and corporate folks engaged in that conversation. One way to, and that's not unique to this last few years, I mean, that's been true for quite some time. One way to do that is to really encourage a conversation about long-term procurement of that and to set up those kinds of models that would incentivize it. But frankly, they're focused more, as Joanna said, on the early stage part of this than on the end of it, and that's unfortunate, I think. But again, I think part of what I was describing that I think this administration could go do by really focusing on discrete and tangible targets that this kind of research is going to lead to, fuel from sunlight at a certain cost per gallon. That would be hugely helpful to these investors to know, sure, that's a place where I feel some confidence that A, that is going to lead towards something in the marketplace, and B, there are people on the customer side who will take that up.
Bob, do you want to have any thoughts to the analogy of the national labs as OPEC? And if so, which OPEC country is Argonne?
I wish. Okay. So the fact of the matter is that the U.S. national labs, we're really talking about what are called the multi-purpose labs, tend to be competitive and very much like the defense labs, Los Alamos and Livermore are competitive. I would argue that that's a good thing in the sense that it's competition, let's face it, is one of the drivers for excellence. You can't win unless you feel just a little bit threatened. Feeling a little threatened is a good thing in my view. But the complication is that we live in a political world, and when politics gets in the way, sometimes it gets also in the way of the kinds of things we'd like to see, which is the innovation part. Just to give you an illustration, the tools that the labs build, for example, modeling, in the ideal world, would be tools that would be open source, available to everybody. After all, they're being built by public money. Many of these tools, as you probably know, are not open source. They're proprietary. And why is that? It's precisely for this reason that the labs see themselves in a competitive environment. So again, there's another issue there that from the federal government point of view, there are steps that could be taken to change that, but they remain to be taken.
If I could just follow up quickly. So in the quadrennial energy review exercise,
Right.
Secretary Moniz insisted on a collaboration effort, and that's why I made the OPEC remark. I was like, okay, we got this money, let's split it up here and move on.
Right. So there are examples where things have really worked out in a much more productive way. Maybe the best example is in high-performance computing, where the labs really have collaborated. Oak Ridge, LBL, Argonne, and the weapons lab. So there is hope. Okay, it can be done.
Thank you. Yes. Oh, or Michael, you have the
Yeah,
hardware.
one of you mentioned about collaboration with Chinese students and American students or researchers. Are there things that you think could be done to safeguard that? It seems like something that could be exploited in a kind of a nationalistic sense that I think would probably be to the detriment of the entire purpose of today's discussion.
So speaking as an academic in a place that relies on Chinese students, I think there are a number of key programs, R&D programs, where if we didn't have Chinese students, we would not be able to maintain those programs. And just making that plain to the political world is key. We rely on foreign students for many of our key R&D programs.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a complicated issue. I think, one thing that is interesting is that, a lot of Chinese students come here and they go back, right? But a lot of them would actually like to stay.
Yes.
Right, and
Yes.
Work in obviously it's difficult to work in a government laboratory or even at a university. There's real hurdles to this, but I think if we want to be training these students and then keeping them, we have to make policy changes there, right? Otherwise, we are essentially sending them back to China to do great things for China.
Yes.
Jane Leggett again. So I've seen a few articles lately called with the technology pork barrel in the title of it. And I'm when we talk about accountability, like setting targets for technologies, is there a credible way to an efficient way to figure out how much money is actually required to meet those targets, to get to particular technology outcomes, realizing that there's some amount of failure in there? And what would you propose in terms of ways to bridge that gap between what funding should actually, is required and how with the technology outcomes?
The question, it builds a little bit on the question raised earlier in the previous session about how do you optimize, how do you figure out how to optimize funding levels broadly in R&D, but then perhaps key to specific technologies?
So my answer would be similar to Michael's answer, which is it's very difficult to do that in a credible way. And there are some, I would say, almost psychological reasons why it's so difficult to do. For example, for certain areas, it's possible to actually come up with a credible financial plan to lay out what would be required to push some technology to a certain point. And there's a number, and you might realize, being the person who's developed that number, that should you make that number public, you will never go down that road. So what you do is you lowball the number. And then surprise, surprise, when you actually get the project going, you discover that you need more money than you had asked for. There are so many examples you can give of that sort of thing going on. So there are incentives built into the system to basically not be able to do what you're asking to do.
Hi, I'm Sue Babinick. I have a purely hypothetical question for our two academics, if you're up for it. Are you? Okay.
What's the question?
Why not?
I don't know.
So imagine a world, and I'm not saying I'm advocating for this, but imagine a world where you could not have access to those foreign students. It's a given, period. No tricks, no loopholes, that's it. So look forward 5 years from where you are right now and give a quantitative answer to what percentage of the quality could you achieve and how would you get it? I'm not talking about the quantity. I'm just saying go for the best stuff. If you look at that 5 years out, what percentage do you think you could achieve and how would you do it?
I'll go first. First of all, I'm one of those people. So I'm a naturalized American citizen. I was not born in this country. So I wouldn't be here. That's point one. Number two is, in many of the areas that I'm interested in, I think my answer would be you'd be nowhere. What you would do is you'd do the work somewhere else, not in the United States.
I don't know if it's really relevant for my work, so I'm not sure I can answer that.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question over here.
Gabe Chan, University of Minnesota. My question is, what's the right kind of institutional setup to do international collaboration here? And we sort of have this idea that there's the double market failure, or you could also think of it, the double public goods of climate mitigation and innovation with spillovers, which would suggest bigger and bigger forms of collaboration, multilateral, UN kind of stuff. But we see like the Green Climate Fund, the technology mechanism, these kinds of UN organizations basically not being able to raise any amount of sufficient funding. So how do we set up collaboration? Is it just going to be a whole bunch of bilateral things like the Belt and Road, or is there a reason to look to the multilateral fora for this?
I think it's not a single answer on that. I think in some cases, for the reasons that I described earlier, I think the multinational effort around this early stage R&D thing is the right model. I do think it brings the right people to the table. For example, it was designed to make sure that the non-OECD countries like China and India are at that table, which if you had gone a different route, they wouldn't have been. It makes sure that some of the non-IEA countries like Chile and the UAE are at the table, right? So like I think you have to look for ways, depending on what the purpose is, to make sure the right members of the club are allowed in, right? So that is useful. On the other hand, for all the reasons we also described, those things are clunky and big, and so bilateral or 3 countries going off and doing something, I think allows a way to kind of down select some of the paths some of those multinational things are on and serve as proof points way sooner than 22 countries would have been. So what I have enjoyed watching is out of mission innovation, a few things that have emerged where 3 countries just go off and do something, they'll bring that back, and that is way better in terms of results than waiting for 22 to get to agreement.
Yeah, I mean, I would maybe just add, if you start with the assumption that sort of resources are scarce and investment needs are large, whatever the number actually is, if you're not coordinating, you're duplicating. And if, ideally, if you are coordinating, you are at least, you're aggregating, or you're sort of looking for ways to combine value added, again, across these scarce areas, and I mean, an example, again, if you look at sort of all the countries that cooperate bilaterally with China, everyone sort of does what they want to do, right? You'll have one country cooperates because in biofuels, because that's what they want to do. Another country does solar, another country does this. It's not coordinated. So, okay, that's fine, but then you sort of lose sight of the kind of where are we going with these technologies in terms of the global trajectory and sort of what are the ultimate outcomes. So I think there's sort of a need for both. I think, too many partners in the room, it's hard to really get anything done, right? So on the, on the kind of early stage R&D side, I think in some ways you want to kind of remove the politics and focus more on the science. But, if you don't have things like mission innovation or sort of ways, or even the UNFCCC, ways for these kind of more high-level political coordination, it's much harder to sort of map out these future trajectories, whether it's technology roadmaps or sort of see where the gaps are on the investment in the RDD and continuum globally and think strategically about that.
Closing thoughts? Okay, well, on that note then, thank you, and please join me in thanking our panel for sharing all their expertise. Thanks.